You know that feeling of quaint nostalgia you sometimes get from reading a book? That's what I got from this one, with, the added layer of murder, colonialism, racism, and kung fu. Hey everyone, Professor August here, and today I'm going to be talking about this book, The Murder of Mr. Ma by Shen and S.J. Rozan. It was published in 2024 by Soho Crime. I love this book. It was exactly what I expected it to be because I've read Rozan's work before, and Shen, of course, is from the Marvel universe, and I think he worked for DC before, and so I kind of expected a good story, and that's exactly what I got. There are lots of elements in this book that I normally teach in my courses, and of course, this is something I want to recommend to my students to read because it's just a fun way to get uh, familiarized with a lot of really heavy topics. So, of course, the book is a detective story. There's a crime that's happening. And so the two main characters are going to try to figure out what that crime is. But alongside the story, there's this history that a lot of Westerners just don't know about, or they're things we learn about in school and promptly forget. Things like anti Asian sentiment and crimes against Chinese immigrants, our disdain for immigrants, generally speaking. Um, I live in California, so the history of anti-Asian sentiment in California goes back a long, long time. So you might think in the modern age there aren't a lot of these things still around. The way that we think has evolved, but recent political activity has shown us the world has changed, but it hasn't changed that much. There's still a lot of stuff that we say and do, and policies we put forth that harm a lot of people. And so this book focuses on Chinese immigrants in London in the 1920s, but so much of that is so familiar to what's happening in the United States today, and also our own history, stuff that we've had to deal with Yellow Peril and the way that we've exploited immigrants and our desire to want to keep them as second class citizens. It just goes on and on and on. The book was fantastic in layering all of these historical tropes and trends into a really cool detective story. The book was written in partnership between John Nee and S.J. Rosen, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, John Nee came up with the story itself, and S.J. Rosen executed it in prose. So I think it's a great collaboration between the two of them because we get a lot of historical aspects, this broad historical lens that John Nee brings to the table, and then the crime detective aspect of it from Rosen. So I think that worked out really well. The story is pretty simple in its telling. So it's two characters, Lao She, and the story is told from Lao She's perspective. He's this kind of like, college professor, intellectual guy. And his partner in the book, who he meets in the first couple of first chapter, is Judge Direnjie. And Direnjie is this historical figure from the 7th century in the Tang Dynasty. He was actually a judge. And so the one anachronism in the book is the entire book, which is the placing of these two characters in the same place in 1924 London. Aside from that, I couldn't spot any anachronism, so that was a job well done. The story follows these two characters trying to figure out who killed Mr. Ma, who is a shopkeeper, and why Mr. Ma's murder and the murder of a few other Chinese immigrants to London is taking place. So, without giving anything away, because it would ruin the whole point of the book, we follow these two characters and their interactions with a slew of characters. Some of them are major, or they turn out to be major later in the book, and some of them are just minor characters that we get to meet, and really they just flesh out what the 1920s looked like in London. um, Really cool was the incorporation of a couple of really famous people like Bertrand Russell and Ezra Pound. I thought those were just like clever little characters to insert, but also like my favorite thing about the book was the inclusion of this Victorian era character named Spring Heeled Jack. And Judge D dresses up like Jack so that he can jump on lampposts and buildings and scare people and do all sorts of things just to drive the plot forward. I was introduced to Spring Heel Jack years and years ago from some like undergraduate literature I read, and he just like pops up once in a while. There's always this lore about him being this like creepy public do-gooder, but like the way he looks is odd and weird, and people in Victorian era Britain were very scared of somebody like that. And so it was a nice little touch to include him. And also on the cover, you see Spring Hill Jack right there. And on the inside cover, um, there he is. You just kind of get like a graphic novel kind of looking picture. I think it was just great. It's just this little nugget that I kind of loved. The two major characters in this book are Laosha and Judge Direnjie. Laosha is a college professor who's living in London teaching Chinese as a foreign language to the British. And that was just hilarious because the book is told from his perspective. And I was a language instructor a long time ago. It isn't like the best job when the students are not super interested in learning a language. They're there because they have to be there, or they're like something they're trying to aspire to and it requires them to study foreign language. So that part of it was like hilarious to me, but it's told from his perspective. So the main narrator is Lao She, and in the first chapter, he meets Judge Di. Di Renjie is this sort of great detective who has a reputation that everybody knows, especially within the Chinese community, but also one of the other characters who is the inspector, Inspector William Bard. He knows D from World War One during while they were in France, and so he already has this like disdain for D. D is drug addicted. He's an opium addict. He is really intelligent. He's really observant, and sometimes he's like pedantic, and so he's not the most likable person, but that's kind of like that's what happens when these characters are just so great. Like you think about Sherlock Holmes, not always the most likable character. That's kind of how Direnjie is. I liked at the very end of the book, there's this little published essay that uh, talks about how in the West we always give parallels just because our brains are too tiny and we can't understand anything that isn't Western. So we think of people or things from China as the blank of China. So Direnjie is the Sherlock Holmes of China, and it's like yes, that is super true. But also we have to take these characters and their histories for themselves. So I'm going to keep the parallels between like Sherlock Holmes and Wilkie Collins and all these other books that we're all familiar with to a minimum. In fact, I'm just not going to do it. These two characters resemble characters we know of, but they are also predating a lot of the characters we know because of basic historical lineage. So it's a good introduction to characters and a history that we as Westerners should just know and read about. So I love the fact that these two characters exist and they're put into 1924 London for us to explore what it was like for Chinese immigrants in that period. Now there are other characters in the book. Some of them are minor and they're they don't really drive the plot forward, but they give us perfect insight into what 1920s Britain was like. So Lao She lives with the Wendells, the mother and the daughter. The mother is like this straight up Victorian lady who just, anything that's foreign and uncomfortable, she's just like, no, no, thank you. The daughter, though, is very similar to some of the characters in Downton Abbey, if you've ever watched the show, where like right after World War One breaks out and it's, everything is over, the women are, I don't want to say they're liberated, but they're kind of like, they do away with a lot of the traditions that kind of kept Victorian women at bay. And so that's what you sort of see with the daughter. And poor Laosha is in love with the daughter, Mary. And Mary is just, she is super unaware of this attraction that Laosha has towards her. These mother-daughter characters are minor characters, but they're just fun to read about. Um, Inspector William Bard, he is an ass. I think that's a nice way to put it. And he's racist, of course. So he knows Judge D from France. And during World War One, Britain and France were, they brought a lot of Chinese people, like over 100,000 Chinese immigrants and laborers to dig trenches and build railroads and build roads. Oh, that sounds really familiar. Where do I know that from? Oh, the United States did that in the West. So there are a lot of parallels between what was happening in Europe in World War One and what the United States did in the 19th century on the West Coast. So that's a really interesting parallel for us. But these, 100,000, 150,000 Chinese laborers who came for during World War One are largely forgotten, and our history textbooks don't really touch upon them. But a lot of them were repatriated back to China, but a lot of them stayed. They stayed in Britain, they stayed in France, and so they're building lives and trying to, just create a livelihood for themselves in this post World War One era. And the Inspector Bard, is familiar with what the Chinese were doing during World War One, and because he's just a racist, he really dislikes living in a city like London with Chinese immigrants who are making it for themselves. They're doing really well and they have lives and they're building wealth. And so he kind of is a foil for us to sort of see the nasty aspects of 20th century, really 19th century yellow peril sentiment. This idea that these Easterners are going to come and destroy everything in the West. They're going to come and like, take over and just ruin our lives. So he's kind of a good foil for that aspect of the book. Interestingly, though, um, a lot of the other characters, so like Ezra Pound, he's one of the characters, and some of the collectors of art, the way they talk about Chinese immigrants is simultaneously eroticizing them and their capacity and their ability to create these beautiful things like art, and also at the same time disparaging them because they are backwards and they aren't British. And that's very much the same thing we've historically done in the United States. Like, we don't really have to look that far into American history to see us doing the same thing. We're doing it in the present. Like, we think of China as this really powerful, innovative country, and they're coming up with battery technologies and all sorts of AI technologies. And at the same time, we are fearful of them, and we're fearful of the Chinese coming and, I don't know, like taking our jobs. And so we haven't changed all that much in 150 years. So all of those elements are in there, and we get to see a lot of it with the inspector. Now, there are other characters. So Mr. Ma, the namesake of the book, we don't actually meet him as a major character. It's his death that prompts the story. And so we get to know him through the telling of what the murder was and why he was murdered. And then there are a couple of other characters like Colonel Livingston. He's an art collector, also kind of racist and sort of like uppity, middle class, upper class, white, rich 1920s British person. And the last character I'll mention, because he's just fun, is Jimmy Fingers. He's a thief, and uh, he kind of gets hired by Judge D. He's kind of a funny character. Like, he gets introduced to Judge D by getting his ass whooped, and then Judge D turns around and hires him because Jimmy Fingers is a thief and also kind of like surrounds himself with people of like the lower working classes. And so Judge D just needs somebody, a man on the inside. And so he pays Jimmy Fingers every once in a while for information. And he's just a nice little character. He's like, you read him and you think, yeah, he's a good kid. He just has it rough. And he really does help the story progress along. The book is actually really easy to read. It's The chapters are short, so it's conducive to reading and then putting it aside for a little bit to go do something else. There's also a lot of like little cliffhangers in the book, so once you come across one of them, you can just put it aside. Not that you'd want to. I didn't. I read it pretty quickly over a span of a couple days. There are like sometimes detective novels and crime novels can go wrong because there are too many red herrings, or like the plot is given away a little too soon. I didn't find that to be the case here. Actually, there were quite enough. Like, there were a few red herrings along the way, and they're kind of like always in detective books, so you can kind of spot them. I'll say this: I had it down to two people who I thought the murderers were, and I was half right. And how is that possible? How can I be half right? Okay. I was right about the person, but I was wrong about the reason. Okay. And so that to me is a hallmark of a good read, when I'm reading a crime novel or a detective novel and there's a little twist that happens and I say, I didn't see that coming, right? Because usually after reading so many books, you kind of think like, I can pretty much plot the book. I know where it's going. That didn't quite happen with this one. I was a little wrong with one of the plot points, and that was a surprise to me, which I really enjoyed. The last 30 pages of it is really where like the apex of the story is, and you get all the details, which is just like every crime novel you get. But I really did enjoy it. So yes, it's an easy read. The language itself is actually very fun to read because it's almost as if it were written in like the 19 teens, 1920s. So there are a lot of antiquated turns of phrases. So it's just fun to get into that and get into that headspace. Um, it's a fun read, but also it's a heavy read sometimes because of the sheer amount of anti-Asian sentiment in the book, which isn't from the author's perspective. I mean, this is just truly what the 1920s were like, and what it was like in the United States, and what it was like in Europe. And so, like, having to read that, sometimes it becomes like emotionally grating because like, we see it in the news still, and we see it with our political figures who, apparently being a xenophobic is a great political strategy these days. So, like, it becomes a little grating sometimes, but it is a necessary plot point, especially with the two major characters, because you get to see an aspect of immigrant narratives that we typically don't get to see, like historical immigrant narratives that's told in a fun way, which is a detective story. So I very much enjoyed this. If you haven't read it, I would put it on your TBR and read it. It is such a great book. The next one is coming out, I think, in April of 2025. So this is going to be a series. I would love to see, the two characters, Direnjie and Lausha, and like, I don't know, in Paris and New York and Chicago. And like, if this is a thing that's going to go on for years and years, I'm sure there are tons of stories that we're going to get from these two authors about these two characters. And if you have read it, tell me what you think about it. I'd love to see what you think in the comments. Otherwise, I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye.
All right, guys, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe below. Catch you in the next video.